All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. We yes, Yana's saying, "Hooray! The closet recordings are back." It's like the old days. In fact, this is more like one of those occasions on which I was sometimes broadcasting in my parents' basement. Remember how I used to joke about that? Well, I'm here as actually you can tell, very sharp observers will be able to tell from the poster behind me. I'm here at Old Orchard Beach in Maine, where I'm on vacation with my family. I am. There's like no internet here, and the Wi-Fi, the cell signal is very bad, and I'm operating on a mobile hotspot here. So, the connection is not great, which means please do keep me posted if the sound goes out on you. I want to make sure I don't. I mean, there's a chance I might lose audio or something. If the connection gets too bad, I might have to cut the video in order to try to preserve the audio. But yeah, Sarah King says needs a little more traffic to add to the atmosphere. Sarah, it is the internet connection isn't quite as good as there when I was out on the back porch that time, Sarah, in my other vacation this summer. But at least I am indoors here this evening, and I'm in my parents' little bungalow, so I don't keep any of the little children up in the house where I'm sleeping in next door. But anyway, so I apologize. I do hope that even if some bits of tonight in the broadcast are a little bit rough, I do hope that the recording, certainly the recording of the audio, will be clean. So if there are bits that you miss, I hope we can at very least get a clean recording so you can catch up on it afterwards. I think we'll be okay. I've broadcast a couple times over this week so far, and it's been all right, though not perfect. So, but again, do keep me posted if things start getting a little strange here. One quick note. Good. Several of you have already noticed that the chat room is back. They did, in fact, fix the chat room this past week. So if you go to the Lays of Beleriand webpage under the Mythgard Academy tab on mythgard.org, you will find the little bouncing chat icon in the bottom right-hand corner of the page. Click on there for those of you who would like to talk amongst yourselves during class here tonight. That's where you can go to do that, and that is finally back now. So that's very excellent. Okay. Two quick announcements, both things that I believe I have mentioned before, but that I want to mention again. One is this coming Monday, on Monday, August 3rd at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Mythgard student Sparrow Alden is going to be giving a special guest lecture explaining her results in her analysis of Tolkien's word usage in The Hobbit. Really fascinating stuff. If you really wanted to see, for instance, exactly how Tolkien went about changing Chapter 5 of The Hobbit between 1937 and 1951, when he went back and did the Lord of the Rings compatible version. There are, of course, parts of the chapter that he took out and other parts that he replaced. Even more fascinating are looking at some of the ways in which he's changed the tone of the whole chapter through some of the word changes that he's made, some of the usage changes that he's made over the course of the chapter. Really, really fascinating stuff. Sparrow is onto some really, really neat things there. For those of you who saw Dr. Mike Drout's talk earlier this year on his Lexomics project and how he's applying that to Beowulf, and he was looking at sort of Tolkien's analysis of Beowulf and what Mike Drout is able to find by using his Lexomics program to study Beowulf. Sparrow is actually using that same program, and she's applying it to The Hobbit instead of to Beowulf, and it's really fascinating stuff. So I encourage you to check that out. That's again Monday at 7:30. I'm going to post the registration link for those of you who are here, so that you can see that. So there you go. The second thing I wanted, and again, I know I've mentioned this before, but that I just wanted to emphasize again tonight, is the really amazing opportunity this coming fall to be able to take Tolkien's class with John Garth. I've been rereading John Garth's book here in the last week, as I have, so reading John Garth's book and reading the Lays of Beleriand as we're doing, studying Tolkien's early work and reading some of John's work on Tolkien's, on Tolkien's life and his sort of influences during that period. John Garth is just such a wonderful reader and such a wonderful thinker about, such a careful researcher into Tolkien's life and history. It's going to be a really amazing class, just a wonderful opportunity to be able to really get into Tolkien's early life and thinking about his work in the context of his early life. I know it's so easy for many people to kind of freeze Tolkien in the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings part of his life, right? To be sort of thinking about what we get in those books and to sort of think of what Tolkien says there as what Tolkien thinks, right? But of course, he took a while getting there, and there were a lot of ideas that he had and a lot of ways that he was thinking about his works prior to that. And so really kind of trying to get your head around where Tolkien came from in his own process of building his mythology and writing these stories is I think so instructive and so very illuminating of his later work. So I certainly hope that you guys will check out Tolkien's Wars in Middle-earth, John Garth's class that he's offering this coming fall. All right, well, let's get back to the Lays of Beleriand. Today we are studying that kind of bridge chapter, right? The two features of the Lays of Beleriand are the alliterative Lay of the Children of Húrin, which we've already talked about, and the Lay of Leithian, which we are about to move to. But in the middle of the book, there's this one short chapter on poems early abandoned. And of course, they're quite short. These are not, one could say that the alliterative Lay of the Children of Húrin is early abandoned in the sense that he only got, well under halfway through that poem. But of course, the other, the poems that are in that middle chapter are very, very early abandoned, right? They're really quite short little stubs. But I think that there's a lot that we can gain from them. When you read Christopher Tolkien's commentary that he includes with those poetic snippets there in the central chapter, you can see, as is appropriate, what Christopher Tolkien's editorial focus is. That is, he is primarily interested in what we can see about the development of Tolkien's ideas, about the development of his mythology in these little snippets. And his commentary is almost entirely focused in that light, which is one of the reasons why I'm not going to focus on that quite so much, because I think Christopher Tolkien does an excellent job of sort of showing and pointing out the really interesting and important bits about those poems. What I want to be doing instead is thinking about what these poems show us about about Tolkien's impulse as a writer at this time. Let me explain what I mean by that. Let's think back to the context, right? When we get these poetic things. And we've talked about this before, but just for a quick review. So we remember the Book of Lost Tales, which he was working on for a long time and had written so much of, has hit a snag, right? He's going to have to go back and revise it completely. He's decided he's got to revise it completely, and he sort of leaves it aside. So what's he going to do instead? As we discussed at the beginning of the class, he's going to focus on first one of his great tales, the Children of Húrin, and then he's going to turn to another one, the Lay of Leithian. And those are very conspicuous, right? The story of Turin Turambar and the story of Beren and Luthien are two of the biggest, most important stories that he ever developed. He's going to come back to those again and again. Those are going to be the ones that we will see him focusing on more really than any other of his Silmarillion stories. So the point is that I would make here is that it's easy to mistake this middle period in the 20s, right? The 1920s is basically the time frame of the Lays of Beleriand, the entire Lays of Beleriand. So we're getting from the Book of Lost Tales period in the late teens up through when he's writing The Hobbit and when he's coming at the Silmarillion again from a broad standpoint, starting to move the whole Silmarillion story as a chronicle forward again. And in that decade in between, in the 20s, we have these two long poems. But the situation that this central chapter I find to be a complete game changer in a sense. Like, we don't get much out of these poems, but to me it really changes how I look at this decade as a whole, right? That is to say, what we're seeing in Tolkien's poetry this decade is more than just Tolkien's sort of obsession with these two particular stories, right? This is not a question of, well, I don't have time to write the Book of Lost Tales, so I think I'm just going to go back and I'm going to try to do justice to my two favorite stories, right? Again, that would suggest that the primary impulse that Tolkien was experiencing in this decade is to tell those stories, right? Is to do justice to those stories. And I think that this central chapter, where we see his very short attempt at a poetic version of the Fall of Gondolin, his attempt at the Flight of the Noldoli, his attempt at the Earendel poem, I think that what these suggest to me is that it's not just about his desire to tell these two stories, but rather a much more general impulse to treat these stories, to treat the stories of the First Age, to treat the Book of Lost Tales material in an epic register and at epic length, okay, and to write them in verse. Right, that's another really, really important thing, and a major shift from the Book of Lost Tales. That we see him decide, okay, no, I'm gonna stick with these stories. I want to, but rather than going back and revising the Book of Lost Tales, I want to do something different. And the different thing that he wanted to do was not just to tell sort of short overviews of these stories all threaded together within his frame tale, as in the Book of Lost Tales, but instead to take the sort of the most pivotal, the most exciting of these, not just the two big ones, but many others, and say, I want to give this a full epic poetry treatment. And again, they're all of them in verse. That's way beyond coincidence, right? It shows very clearly that his creative impulse during this time, his storytelling impulse during this time, has shifted from the Book of Lost Tales period entirely to verse. In a sense, the 20s are the most active poetic period of Tolkien's entire life. You can see this even when you look at the poems that he wrote, totally unrelated to the mythology. Or, well, that's a little hard. Many of his poems are related to the mythology, even if they're not part of the story. But again, when you look at the other poems that he wrote at this time, even poems like the Man in the Moon poems and the Freaks of Physiologus, that is the Yumbo or You Kind of Elephant, and Fastatokalon, both of which, the former heavily revised, made it into the Adventures of Tom Bombadil. All of those kinds of poems, the Bimble Bay poems. He's writing poetry. He's writing so much poetry during this period. In the class on Tolkien's poetry that I just finished last week at Mythgard, we read a whole lot of his poems from the 20s. But it's not just that he's writing all these other poems. It's that his entire creative process for his legendarium has shifted into a poetic mode during this decade too. So the 1920s are like it's like the decade of poetry, where Tolkien seems to have made the conscious choice, in coming from the Book of Lost Tales, seems to have made the conscious choice, poetry, an epic poetry mode, a long form narrative poem. This is the best way for me to tell these stories. This is the way in which I really want these stories to be told and to be read and to be published. Because don't forget, as I've mentioned before, he actually had submitted, he actually will submit the Lay of Leithian for consideration by Allen and Unwin to publish when he publishes The Hobbit and they love it and they ask him for something more and he's like, I don't have a sequel, but what do you think of this, right? So we know that even then, now almost a whole decade later, by the end of the 30s, he's still looking back and thinking of the Lay of Leithian as like the thing. When he's talking about wanting to get some of his Silmarillion stuff published, it's the Lay of Leithian that he's trying to get published. So again, he seems to be believing here during the 20s that the sort of destiny, in a sense, it's a melodramatic way to say it, but sort of the destiny of his legendarium, the destiny of his stories, is as long form epic poems, which is kind of a sort of a mind-blowing idea, right? For those of us, who have all kind of, grown up in the post-Lord of the Rings period, thinking of Tolkien, of course, primarily as the great fantasy novelist of the 20th century. Not novelist. He always hated being called a novelist and hated the Lord of the Rings being called a novel. It's a romance, he always said, not a novel. But anyway, so there's... It's, as I say, it's kind of strange for us, looking backwards, to sort of imagine the young Tolkien. And he's not, a teenager, of course. We're talking in the 20s. So Tolkien is in his early 30s. It's sort of around the first half of his 30s is what we're talking about. So here's this guy in his 30s, settling down, having kids, teaching in his first, real teaching position at the University of Leeds, and deciding where he wants his creative life to go is as a modern English epic poet. A modern English epic poet writing primarily in old and even sort of throwback medieval modes, like the alliterative poetry that he's doing. Exactly. Tom Hillman says he's writing epic poetry. He's writing alliterative epic poetry while Fitzgerald is writing The Great Gatsby. Exactly. Yes. That's precisely what's happening. And at the same time, of course, that sort of the revolutions of English poetry are happening. We're getting Ezra Pound and some of the early T.S. Eliot and Joyce is out there, right? All this is happening at about that time. So while English poetry, the English poetry world is sort of kind of revolving, well, it's an exaggeration to say it's revolving around Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound certainly felt that it was, but perhaps it's giving him too much credit. But anyway, as the 20th century is going into doing its modernist thing and starting to shift away from traditional poetic forms, here's Tolkien cheerfully setting out to make a career for himself as an epic poet writing alliterative verse. It seems a little crazy, right? It's very strange. It's very different. But again, I think this chapter gives us a more clear view of that than anywhere else. This is not just, I love the story of the children of Hurin, and what the heck, I'm going to do it in alliterative verse, right? It's more than that. It's, we can see a kind of plan, or at least a notion, right? I want to tell all of these stories in epic verse. It's amazing. It's amazing. Okay, let's see. A couple questions here. Shelby asks a good question. Had Tolkien created his languages in depth at this point, or did they come after he had been working on his languages already? Now, the process of his language creation goes back a really long time and is long and complicated, it's a tricky question, Shelby, therefore, to answer simply. That is to say, if by his two languages, his languages, you mean like Quenya and Sindarin, the answer is sort of, right? They had different names at this point. They were still to undergo a lot of development. I mean, he was kind of tinkering with the forms of his languages for a really long time, like arguably his whole life. But to speak vaguely, to speak generally, yes, he had already invented his languages. You can see basically the chronology of his language development and of his story writing bears out the description that he gives of it in the preface to the second edition of the Fellowship of the Ring, when he says that his work, his story of the Legends of the Elder Days, was principally linguistic in inspiration, and was designed to give a sort of an appropriate background of history for the development of Elvish tongues. And I know that when people read that in the preface, it kind of seems like it's probably an exaggeration, right? Like, are you really telling me that it's not that you wrote those languages in order to sort of flesh out your story, right? Are you really telling me that you invented the languages first and are just like, I need some explanation for how these languages came about, so I'm going to make all these stories, and that's how he wrote the Silmarillion? And the answer seems to be, yeah, pretty much. That's exactly how it happened. I mean, I don't know what to say there, but that's. I mean, I can't. That whole concept is so alien to me. It's one of the things that I find, Tolkien's. I like language, and I love learning about Tolkien's languages. But I do not myself share Tolkien's passion for philology, the passion for understanding the nature of languages and the changes of languages, which fueled so much of Tolkien's imaginative life. Is kind of alien to me, so I really can't imagine sort of composing stories in that way and for those reasons. Sarah King with a statement which is a nominee for Understatement of the Day. Tolkien is a bit of a nerd. Yes, he was a bit of a nerd. Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, like doing the whole, I'm going to write these, like, over the course of my career, thousands of pages of stories, just in order to give a bit of background to make sense of these languages that I've made. Yeah, that's kind of Tolkien was kind of a super geek when it came to that stuff. But hey, that's cool. I think we all like and appreciate that. Okay, so. Now, as I said, coming back to these poems and looking at these snippets of poems tonight, what I want to do is, so having thought about where Tolkien's mind is, where it seems like where the evidence here suggests his concept of his own kind of creative career here is. As I said, Christopher Tolkien's interest is on tracing the development of the mythology. We're not gonna. I mean, that's awesome, but that's not what we're gonna do. I want to see what we see from these as stories, what we can hear in these as poems, what we can learn from this, what kind of stories Tolkien seems to be writing. And then at the end of class today, we're going to transition into looking towards the Lay of Beleriand and actually getting back to discussing the poem, the Light as a Leaf on Linden Tree poem that we didn't get back to last time. Okay, let's. I want to start with the third of the poems that Christopher Tolkien presents, and I want to do that mostly on the strength of the fact that Christopher mentioned in his commentary that he believes that this one was probably the first of the three of these three snippets to have been written, and that it probably even predates the Lay of the Children of Húrin. So I thought that seemed a sensible place to begin, therefore, on that reason. Now, of course, it makes a certain amount of sense that he would begin with a Fall of Gondolin poem, as, of course, the Fall of Gondolin appears to be where pretty much all of the stories began. The prose version of the Fall of Gondolin, the one that's included in the Book of Lost Tales, and the longest, fullest version of the Fall of Gondolin that he ever wrote anywhere, through the entire rest of his life. That was, again, it's the very earliest surviving story, as far as we know and understand correctly, that we have of Tolkien's work. So it kind of makes sense that when he decides, hey, no, I'm going to do a poetic version of these stories, that he would say, hey, wait, why not start with the Fall of Gondolin? Look at what we have here. So first of all, I want you guys to tell me, what are we looking at here, poetically speaking? What are we listening to? What is the form of this poem as we get it? It's only a small section. It's only about half of the snippet that we have. But listen to the sound of this and how this poem works. And again, as I read it, tell me what you notice about its meter and about its sound. Make note, too, of any sort of particularly interesting images or sort of story snippets that we get. And please enter your observations in the questions box as we go, and I'll come back to those after I read it. 'Twas the bent blades of the Glamhoth that drank Fingolfin's life, as he stood alone by Feanor, but his maiden and his wife were wildered as they sought him in the forests of the night, in the pathless woods of Doriath, so dark that as a light of palely mirrored moonsheen were their slender elfin limbs, straying among the black holes where only the dim bat skims from Thu's dark delved caverns. Their ale saw that sheen, and he caught the white-limbed Isfin, that she ever since hath been his mate in Doriath's forest, where she weepeth in the gloom. Where she weepeth in the gloam, for the dark elves were his kindred that wander without home. Okay. What do you notice? What do you hear here? Okay, good. Creative first, it rhymes, right? Good and excellent initial observation, okay? The first thing that we can notice, of course, is that this is not alliterative meter, right? This is a syllabic meter, and that is to say it's one that's, the alliterative meters, you don't count the syllables, right? You only count the beats. This is a syllabic meter, and just in couplets, right? James, you're right. There are repeated consonants here or there. We do get alliteration more than occasionally in these verses, right? In fact, we can see the alliteration creeping up quite a bit. Not in any, at least not in any obvious pattern that I discern. Again, it's not following the alliterative verse pattern, certainly. But we do hear the alliteration, right? The bent blades, even things like were wildered, right? Of Doriath, so dark, mirrored moonsheen, dark delved, line 10. Line 10 is correct. That is, it's correct on the slide. That's what is printed in the book. Straying among the black holes where only the dim bat skims. That's got to be a mistake, though. That can't be right, can it? Black holes? Surely it's black bowls? Straying among the black bowls, B-O-L-E-S, like the trunks of trees? He's not straying. They're not straying among the holes. They're in the trees. They're in the forest. Right? And black bowls alliterates, just like bent blades and mirrored moonsheen and dark delved, right? Where we do see the pattern, the only pattern that we do see in the alliteration is that tendency towards repeated words like that, right? Adjacent words alliterating. So I'm looking at that and I'm like, is that a mistake? I wonder if that's a mistake. I wonder, is that the publisher's mistake? Is it Christopher's mistake? Heck, might it even have been J.R.R. Tolkien's mistake? I mean, maybe he miswrote it. I don't know, but I'm just looking at that. I'm like, surely he must have meant black bowls, right? But anyway, okay. But so getting back to the observations, we do see, as James points out, we do get alliteration. Notice what else these lines have in common with alliterative verse. Again, it's not the alliterative meter. But you notice what else they have in common? There's another way in which the sound of these... Sorry, Tom Hillman is suggesting, no, it's actually black voles. Right, yeah, no, Tom, I'm sure that's it. Yes, there were all these black rodents around with the dim bats skimming through them. That's probably it. Absolutely good. Kate and Erica and Nancy and Kurita, excellent. Coming straight out of the poetry class, they're all tuned to this. Absolutely, there's a break in the middle of the lines. The shape of all of these lines is that there is a break in the middle. Again, not every single line doesn't have a syntactic break, like a comma or a period or a semicolon, but many of them do, and even of the ones that don't, there is sort of a kind of caesura in the middle. 'Twas the bent blades of the Glamhoth that drank Fingolfin's life, as he stood alone by Feanor. But his maiden and his wife were wildered as they sought him in the forests of the night, in the pathless woods of Doriath, so dark that as a light of palely mirrored moonsheen. Even the way, Kate, as you had pointed out before, there's a lot of enjambment in these lines. It moves on, right? So dark that as a light of palely mirrored moonsheen, where their slender elfin limbs straying among the black bowls, where only the dim bat skims from Thu's dark delved caverns. Period. Their ale saw that sheen. The flow of the lines here also reminds me of alliterative verse. That is, you may remember, if you sort of think back to kind of the cadences of the alliterative lines in the Lay of the Children of Húrin, that was pretty common. It's pretty common for Tolkien to sort of end his sentence, for instance, in the middle of the line, at the caesura, and to use the alliteration within the alliterative line as a kind of bridge between one thought and another. Those lines, the alliterative lines, are pretty persistently enjammed. I mean, as you may remember from the Lay of the Children of Húrin, one sentence, right, from that would tend to span many, many lines, right? And so the ideas sort of keep flowing over from one line to the next, and that sense of momentum is one of the things that I find very characteristic of alliterative lines in general, and especially of Tolkien's usage of alliterative lines. And there's a similar kind of feel. I think that we can see and more importantly here, some similarities in the flow of these lines between that tendency to have a sort of a caesura in the middle of the line, and the way that these sentences and lines are structured, and then you add in, as James pointed out, that tendency towards, though a non-systematic, use of alliteration in these lines, and this begins to this begins to sort of sound like syllabic poem, a syllabic meter that really wishes it were an alliterative meter. And to me, it's especially interesting. Christopher doesn't mention this. He doesn't talk about the prosody. He doesn't talk about the metrical structure of these lines in the context of his mentioning that he thought that this poem, this was the first of the poems, and that it even came before the Lay of the Children of Húrin. But to me, it's fascinating that if Christopher's right, and he did start with this. So he's come from he's come from the Book of Lost Tales, and he says, okay, let's go back. Let's new plan, right? Forget the Book of Lost Tales. Let's do epic poems, right? Let's do epic poem versions of all of these. Let's do the Fall of Gondolin. No, let's do the Fall of the Noldoli. We'll do the kinslaying and the crossing and the Helcarax. It's going to be awesome, right? Okay, no. Eärendil, that's totally what we're going to do into Eärendil, right? No, Children of Húrin. No, absolutely the Children of Húrin. That's what we're doing, right? So if we see during this time, if that's what's going on in Tolkien's mind, right? The idea that he starts with this one and says, okay, so I'm going to write an epic poetry version. So it's going to be in couplets, right? He's still doing, again, I hesitate to call it modern poetry, a modern poetic style, because as I said, this is not how modern poets are writing in the 20s at all. They're writing lots of sort of free verse and experimental stuff, and specifically turning away from all of the traditional metrical styles of earlier English poetry. But anyway, nevertheless, it's still a more modern style than alliterative verse is, which had been out of fashion for many centuries, pretty much by that time. What's the meter, by the way? Somebody give me the meter of this poem? Okay, so for those of you who didn't take the poetry class with me, the first thing to do in trying to figure out the meter of a poem, to kind of get the rhythm of it in your head, is to count the number of stressed syllables in a line, right? Forget everything else and just count the stresses. Where do the beats fall? How many beats per line? 'Twas the bent blades of the Glamhoth that drank Fingolfin's life, as he stood alone by Feanor, but his maiden and his wife were wildered as they sought him in the forests of the night, in the pathless woods of Doriath, so dark that as a light of palely mirrored moonsheen were their slender elfin limbs, straying among the black bowls where only the dim bat skims. Mostly 6. Some might be 7, but I think Sarah. I think it's iambic hexameter. There are some that seem maybe to be 7, and iambic heptameter is one of Tolkien's favorite meters. You will know iambic heptameter, for instance, from the elf poetry. It's in the poetry class we called that elf meter. That's the meter of Galadriel's verses, for instance. I sang of leaves of gold, and leaves of gold there grew. I sang of leaves of gold, and leaves of gold there grew. The Nimrodel poem, the lines are divided, but it's pretty much iambic heptameter too. And cursed the faithless ship that bore him far from Nimrodel. That 7 iambic foot line is a favorite of Tolkien's, but this doesn't have the feeling to me of the iambic heptameter, and most of the lines I think have pretty clearly 6 beats instead of 7, and they're much more irregular. They're nothing like as smooth and regular. Galadriel's I Sang of Leaves poem is almost entirely even. It's almost perfect. Every line has the perfect number of syllables. Almost every line has the perfect number of syllables in a perfectly even iambic beat. If you want a special bonus, go back and read that poem carefully and find the one line where he deviates from the meter. And when you find that, you will notice an awesome thing. It's so cool. I won't spoil it for you. So go back and read that poem and find the one bad line in the one place where he deviates from the meter, and it's so cool. But anyway, it's nothing. This poem is nothing like as regular as that, right? It's much more erratic. Again, to me, it's kind of tending towards the alliterative line. It's got the beats, but it doesn't really stick with an iambic flow. It's still, I would call this iambs, where wildered as they sought him in the forests of the night is still an iambic pattern. The whole thing has a generally iambic pattern, but it deviates from it all over the place. It has a much more irregular feeling. So again, this metrically, I find this poem fascinating because it sounds like a syllabic poem that really, in its heart of hearts, wishes it were an alliterative poem. And then, of course, well, what do we see? We see him turning to, him just basically saying, "Forget it. Okay, fine. I'm just going to do straight up. I'm going to adopt the antiquated alliterative meter as my vehicle, right? That's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to go, and I don't care that nobody does this anymore. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write hundreds and hundreds of lines of modern alliterative meter, because that's what I want to do." So all by itself, even without, notice we haven't said a thing about the actual content of these lines yet, or what he's talking about in this opening of the Fall of Gondolin story, and yet we can already see some pretty interesting stuff here, right? But now, thinking about the content, what do we see? What's interesting about this beginning of the story? What's interesting about what we get here, going back to some of the observations you guys had made before? Nancy, I agree that Doriath is super creepy here. Absolutely super creepy. And I don't know exactly what to do within the pathless woods of Doriath. Is he reimagining Doriath here? Is this the consequence? I mean, the woods, the woods of Doriath were pathless in the sense, with the girdle of Melian and stuff. So I mean, is that how we're supposed to, is that kind of the context of this? It's a little bit unclear. I mean, notice that, remember in the published Silmarillion, Eol lives in Nan Elmoth, which is like this separate, it's like this like little backwater of the woods of, it's attached to Doriath. It's technically part of Doriath, and he's got to, like, he had to pay rent to Thingol in order to live there, grudgingly. But so it's not mainstream Doriath, right? So if Nan Elmoth, where Eol the Dark Elf lives, is dark and creepy, that's not Melian's fault, and it's not a reflection on Thingol. It's just it's a separate, like, little it's a bad neighborhood in Doriath, right? But that seems, when we read this, we've read descriptions of Doriath. I mean, of course, a big chunk of the Children of Húrin took place in Doriath. and Doriath didn't look like this. Doriath wasn't that creepy. Again, it was hard to get in. They were all bewildered and everything, and about to like die of hunger and thirst and stuff. But it wasn't like Tower Nufuin, right? It wasn't like, remember that Proto Mirkwood place where Turin was taken and where Beleg rescued him? Doriath wasn't like that, right? And yet this makes Doriath sound almost like that. So to me, it's interesting that we get like the girdle and then Happy Doriath in the middle, right? In the way of the Children of Hurin. Here in this one little glimpse of the place of Eol the Dark Elf, we get creepy Doriath, and then in the published Silmarillion we get both, right? A little creepy neighborhood, sort of adjacent to nice Doriath. He seems to kind of kept both, and yet this impulse seems to be different. I mean, it may well turn out that had he written more of the poem, that we would perhaps it was in fact already that it's only just this one bit of Doriath, right? That's creepy. It's not all that creepy, but I don't know. Maybe that's not in fact the conception here. In fact, again, especially if this poem predates the alliterative Children of Hurin, it may well be that the darkness of Tower Nufuin, that Proto Mirkwood thing, was originally part of Tolkien's conception of Doriath, and he's kind of projected it out to Tower Nufuin, right? So when he gets to the way of the Children of Hurin, he takes that dark and creepy Doriath, separates it from Doriath itself, and moves it somewhere else. But maybe it was in his own mind. It seems possible that in his own imagination he was actually envisioning Doriath as being creepy like that. James, that's a great question. James asks, is this the first application of Doriath? That was not its name in the Book of Lost Tales, James. It was Artenor in the Book of Lost Tales. It's Doriath in the alliterative Lay of the Children of Hurin. But again, if this predates it, then this would be the first usage of Doriath. I believe that's true. But good. Now Brian points out, and Brian Dimmick points out, and somebody else was talking about this. Joe earlier on says that it talks about the light and darkness imagery. It is really stark in this passage, isn't it? Notice how the white-limbed Isfin, right, the slender elfin limbs of Fingolfin's maiden and his wife. Those are two different people, by the way. His maiden is his daughter. That would be a slightly odd way of, a very archaic way of saying that. But yeah, that's so his daughter and his wife are lost. And it's so dark that the moonlight, palely mirrored by their slender elfin limbs, looks white in the darkness, right? So that the darkness surrounding them and them kind of shining, even just reflecting dimly, palely the light of the moon, really stands out in the darkness. And Eol, who seems to be part of that darkness, right? He is a dark elf, which may have other meanings and not be simply a physical description. And yet, in the context here, it sounds almost physical, right? Like he is completely, he is like a shadow among the shadows, and they are these glowing moonlight shining, radiant figures going through the woods. So the contrast there is extremely sharp between them. And where are we going with this? Why are we talking about this? That is to say, why are we starting this poem here? What does this have to do with the poem? What? Yeah, as of Maegwyn and the fall of Gondolin, Sarah King, exactly. And as Kate Neville says, just to explain the eventual betrayal. Absolutely. Isn't that fascinating? Isn't that fascinating that his choice here, again, in as much, and it's always, I should have given earlier a kind of a blanket apology or disclaimer for the fact that in drawing any kinds of conclusions about any of these poems, we have to be a little bit reckless, right? Because we get so little, and so to try to extrapolate to things like what was his plan for the Fall of Gondolin poem based on this like handful of lines that we have. That's we can't be at all sure, so we have to put lots of asterisks next to any of the sort of conclusions that we suggest here. But if this is the beginning, and that does in all of the rest of Tolkien's compositions, and looking at his composition process, he did tend to begin at the beginnings. He wasn't one who would like have a scene come to him and he'd do that, and then but that would end up being chapter 5. That's not usually how he did things. So I enter into this under the assumption that this is in fact going to be where the poem is going to open, and it's dramatically intriguing and even appealing to begin with the story of the conception of Maeglin. And how, so that basically the whole story of the fall of Gondolin begins with the origin of the eventual traitor of Gondolin. And going back to this light and darkness images, isn't that interesting, right? That Maeglin, in his, the sort of, again, the sort of the parentage and the roots of Maeglin are this like light in the darkness thing. He is the child of both the mirrored moon sheen and the dark, the gloam of Doriath's forest. He is the child of both of those things, and I wonder, were we going to see those things at war within him? Maeglin's character, Meglin, as it was in the Book of Lost Tales, was much simpler, in a sense. I think much simpler in the Book of Lost Tales version. It's enough to make me wonder if we're going to get a if we would have gotten a much more complicated version of Meglin here with the light and shadow things going on. I don't know, but anyway, it's very cool. Sarah asks, would these be the literal first lines? Well, no, I skipped 4 of them, right? So the first 4 lines would be, but yeah, no invocation of the Valar. That's kind of unusual, really, to do. I mean, remember we were talking about that with, when he revised the Way of the Children of Hurin in the second version, he added that invocation at the beginning, right? But that's not, apparently, I mean, even within the Way of the Children of Hurin, that's not where he started, right? The first version didn't contain that. He decided to add it in, but none of these others really seem to start like that either. So, yeah. Sorry, I just thought of something, which is really interesting. At least I find it interesting. Thu's Dark Delvid Caverns. The Dimbat skims from Thu's Dark Delvid Caverns. Thu, who will become Sauron, Thu the Necromancer, will come to be associated with Tower Nufuin in the post-Lay of Leithian conception. In the Lay of Leithian, Thu will be driven out as Sauron is in the published Silmarillion, and he will take refuge in Tower Nufuin as he does in the published Silmarillion, and he will fill it with darkness and horror as he does in the published Silmarillion, which of course obviously establishes another link between Tower Nufuin in the Lay of the Children of Hurin and the Lay of Leithian, and Mirkwood in The Hobbit, where the Necromancer lives, right? And filled with darkness and horror, possibly by the Necromancer. But notice, it seems to be Doriath. Based on what we can see here, the implication where only the dim bat skims from Thu's Dark Delvid Caverns, I mean, it's quite possible, maybe the dim bats have come a really long way from Thu's Dark Delvid Caverns, which are nowhere near Doriath. But that doesn't seem to be the implication of the line, right? It seems to suggest to me that the darkness of Thu the Necromancer is here in Doriath. Does this suggest that his conception of Doriath in this time consisted in this, like, darkness versus light thing there? That is to say that with that Thingol and Menegroth, well, that's a concept, though he wasn't named that, which goes back to the Book of Lost Tales. So the idea of that Thingol and Melian are there in Doriath, but Thu is also there, like the way that you've got Celeborn and Galadriel, and you've got Thranduil, and you've got the Dol Guldur and the Necromancer in between. Is it more of that kind of a was that more like the situation that he's envisioning here? I don't know. I wonder that I hadn't thought about that before, but yeah, exactly. Kate is saying Thu's caverns versus Thingol's caverns. Yeah, you've got the good caves and the bad caves, right? The good caves and the evil caves here within Doriath. That seems entirely possible. Yeah, Tom Hillman says, in this telling, Eol and Isfin are virtually the anti-Baron and anti-Luthien. Yeah, there are creepy similarities there, right? Tom was also was reminded of Tolkien's poem, The Shadow Bride, or The Shadow Man, as it was in the original version, which you can read The Shadow Bride in The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. But again, it's this motif of this really creepy guy who sits there, who may or may not be turned into a statue, and then this woman comes by and he like pounces and takes her underground to live with him forever. And it may or may not be creepy, or it might be romantic. He might be kidnapping her, or she might be disenchanting him. Not 100% clear, especially in the earlier version of the poem. But so yeah, Tom, I agree. There's some similarities here, right? And of course to the Baron and Luthien story. I agree. Yeah, and Kate Neville, Tom would add, she was thinking of poor Maiglin as being the anti-Eärendil, right? Yeah, exactly. The one who is destined to bring despair and destruction to the people, right? The prophecy, because there is almost that sense of prophecy. Remember, again, if you did the Book of Lost Tales class, remember the weight, the prophetic weight that was given, the nearly messianic terms in which Eärendil was spoken of in the Book of Lost Tales, right? And from these two shall come one, then shall bestride the earth the great one that shall do that. Eärendil was like, was born to the blasting of fanfare, prophetic fanfares, right? There is almost a similar thing with Maegwyn. Again, we haven't gotten to the sort of prophecies of Maegwyn's birth in the same way, but yeah, the portentousness of and this is the story of how Maegwyn came to be, and yet he's not to be the hero, but the villain, but the traitor. And I find that such a fascinating opening to the story. And then Jan, of course, as you point out, Eärendil in the Book of Lost Tales doesn't even do much when we finally get him. Yeah, so true. Anyway, I was going to say we don't have time to talk much more about the Fall of Gondolin, but there isn't much more of the Fall of Gondolin, so that's okay. Let's look at one of the other poems, and I'm not going to linger quite as long on each one of these passages. But this is the opening. These are the first lines of the Flight of the Noldoli. So here, this is the beginning of the epic poetry treatment of the rebellion of the Noldor. It would presumably, as Christopher says, have included the kinslaying and the prophecy of the North, and so we get. Oh man, I add to my list of like things I really, really, really wish Tolkien had finished. Can you imagine the Curse of Mandos in alliterative verse? Oh man, that would have ruled. Oh. Anyway. And presumably, maybe the burning of the ships and the crossing of the Helcaraxa would have been awesome. Great idea, though he doesn't get too far with it. But here's the opening. Ah, the trees of light, tall and shapely, gold and silver, more glorious than the sun, than the moon more magical, or the meads of the gods, their fragrant frith and flower-laden gardens gleaming, once gladly shone. In death they are darkened, they drop their leaves from blackened branches, bled by Morgoth, and Ungoliant the grim, the gloom-weaver. In spider's form, despair and shadow, a shuddering fear and shapeless night, she weaves in a web of winding venom that is black and breathless. Their branches fail, the light and laughter of their leaves are quenched. Murk goes marching, mists of blackness, through the halls of the mighty, hushed and empty, the gates of the gods are in gloom mantled. Yeah, Karita, don't be thinking about Watership Down with Frith. It's a different Frith. Yeah. Unrelated. No relation to Frith. Yeah, James points out, he says he loves a sudden transition from light to dark in lines 5 to 6. Their fragrant frith and flower-laden gardens gleaming, once gladly shone. In death they are darkened. They drop their leaves from the blackened branches. James, that shift, right? The first 5 lines, we get 5 lines of the noontide of Valinor, right? A 5-line glimpse into the light and glory and splendor of Valinor beneath the trees. Not just the light. That's the important thing about the frith, right? The fragrant frith and flower-laden gardens gleaming. A frith, if I'm remembering this correctly, frith means like a fertile land, land that's growing and sprouting with things. So that's why it's fragrant frith and flower-laden gardens. So it's full of light, yes, but it's full of growth and it's full of life and it's full of health. And then, James, as you point out, that incredibly sudden and jarring shift. In death they are darkened. It turns out that description was just a kind of tease. The trees of light, tall and shapely, gold and silver, more magical than the sun. Notice there's a kind of, not exactly trick, but the first 4 lines make it sound like it's describing the present, right? Because of the way that in the flow of alliterative verse, the verb tends to be held until the end of the line. Right, again, he's following Anglo-Saxon usage here. The consequence of that, in that first sentence, in the first 5 lines there, is to give us a glimpse of the noontide of Valinor as it would have been, and then the horrible reality is kind of brought in, like, it's like the rug is pulled out from us at the end of the sentence, right? Once gladly shown. Oh, that's not how things are, right? I'm not describing a present thing. I'm telling you how things used to be. And then we get the present tense. In death they are darkened. They drop their leaves from the blackened branches, bled by Morgoth. That's the present tense. And it's... So, I mean, that I find that really powerful. This is one of the... I'm fascinated in this passage. Again, not in the way that Christopher's focusing on it as being a really interesting treatment of the, how is the story changing, how is the mythology developing in Tolkien's mind, but what's the story here, right? When he's sitting down to tell the story of the darkening of Valinor here, how does he do it? I mean, this is one of the this kind of a comparatively extended, it's only 16 lines, but comparatively extended poetic description of the darkening is great. I mean, I think it's really powerful. What else do you notice? Anything else strike you about this early passage here? And now think about, like we were thinking with the Fall of Gondolin poem, the flight of the Noldoli. Where do we start? we start with the darkening of Valinor. But we start right after Valinor has been darkened, right? And again, those first 4 or 5 lines really again jump out at me, right? The first moment of the poem is standing in the darkness after the darkening has happened, remembering back, looking back at the light, the trees of light, tall and shapely. Good. Sarah King says, drop their leaves, something that really jumps out at her. Every other instance in Tolkien's work of leafless trees may be an echo of this. It certainly is, Sarah King, I agree, a very powerful image there of in death they are darkened, they drop their leaves. The active verb there, the transitive verb, that is, a transitive verb, of course, meaning a verb that takes a direct object. An intransitive verb is a verb that doesn't take a direct object. So normally, it's much more common to talk about leaves falling, right? That's an intransitive verb. It's just talking about what the leaves are doing. The trees are usually passive in the process of the leaf dropping. Again, that's the more common way to sort of talk about it. But this is, Sarah, an emphatically active thing, right? An emphatically transitive expression. It's the trees that are dropping their leaves because they're dead, right? It's emphasizing the death of the trees. It's not the fall of the leaves that matters. It's the death of the trees and the fact that not that their leaves are falling, but that they are dropping them. It has been bled. The trees have been bled by Morgoth and Ungoliant the Grim. Arthur says darkness is personified. More than light is. Or, well, Arthur, I mean, it seems clearly the sort of personification, if that's the right word, arborification of light is in the trees, right? The trees of light. So you've got the trees of light, which seem to embody light, and then you've got Ungoliant the Grim, the Gloom Weaver, right? The one who in spider's form weaves a web of winding venom. Despair and shadow. She weaves in a web of winding venom. She weaves despair, shadow, a shuddering fear, and shapeless night. In a web of winding venom that is black and breathless. Yeah, and Nancy, exactly. The arachnification of darkness. Yes, we've got the arborification versus the arachnification. But those two images are really powerful. And these are not new, of course, right? He's Ungoliant, the Gloom Weaver, and the two trees long predate this version of the poem. It's not like it's an innovation. But again, that's to me what's really interesting, right? If you're thinking it only in the big Silmarillion terms, right? If you're thinking of it only as this description is a stage in the development of the mythology, you sort of pass over that and be like, nothing new there, right? It's all old stuff, right? So he's still thinking the same thing as he was before. But the way that this comes out poetically, the way that those two are being balanced against each other, strikes us much more forcibly. I think it was a good idea for him to do these stories in poetic form. I'm all in favor. I think the poetic versions are great. I wish he'd always written poetry. I wish The Lord of the Rings had been an epic poem instead of prose. But I suppose I probably am in a minority there. Good. So looking at other comments here. Interesting. Sue Gifford says, in the description of the death of the trees, the branches fail. Their branches fail. The light and laughter of their leaves are quenched. Sue says that it's the death of the trees is depicted almost like a human death, like a body failing and dying. Yes, that sort of the power of that is very much sort of the equal of the power of depicting the death of of a person, sort of the light and life passing out of it. Yeah, yeah. But okay, let's go on and look at some other things. So we begin with the darkening of Valinor. Oh wait, but I didn't follow up my question from before. What's interesting about this is the beginning point of the poem. What does this suggest to us? Just as we were making wild extrapolations about the beginning of the Fall of Gondolin, let's make wild extrapolations about the beginning of this poem. And I've got a theory. My theory is Feanor. Of course, the parallel between the trees and the Silmarils is very clear and made explicit, not only in the earlier versions, but in this very poem itself. After all, we get like a whole 145 lines of this poem, right? So we have a lot to judge. It's not reckless at all to make conclusions about that. I'm being sarcastic. But anyway, I wonder, just as we're getting this sort of epic setup of Meglin and the planting of the seeds, sort of the sowing of the seeds of treachery in the beginning of the Fall of Gondolin poem, which is a very interesting way to contextualize the story of the Fall of Gondolin. So here we're getting the death of the trees, and the really moving description of the death of the trees, as and the fading of the light and the dropping of the leaves and the failing of the branches, as the context for the story of the rebellion of the Noldor. Which ultimately, certainly in the published Silmarillion, one of the emphases of that story is that, remember that moment in the published Silmarillion where we get the Valar mourning for the marring of Feanor. And they consider that, one of the worst of the deeds of Melkor, that Feanor is, lots of Tolkien fans dislike Feanor, and he's kind of a jerk. But, okay, that's a little bit of an understatement. He's a lot of a jerk. But he was the greatest of all of the elves. He was the most gifted, the most powerful. The potential of Feanor was greater. He could have done such great things, and yet he was twisted. And I wonder if we're getting sort of if in the initial scene here, we're sort of seeing... But notice it's already too late, right? The trees, we're not watching the trees die, we're remembering the trees dying. It's done, right? It's already happened. Valinor is dark at the beginning of this poem, and at the beginning, Feanor's done, right? He's already crossed the Rubicon. The rebellion of Feanor, his turning point, it's already happened. Feanor's heart is already darkened at the beginning of this poem, and I wonder if that's sort of where he was going with that. I don't know. Yeah, Joe, I think there is a parallel between Feanor and Melkor. I think it's clearer in the published Silmarillion than certainly in these poems. But yeah. Kurita is paralleling these statements. Feanor was a bit of a jerk in the same way that Tolkien was a bit of a nerd. Okay, fair enough. Okay. Two other passages that I found really interesting in this, snippet of poem, because we don't get anything like this, or at least nothing as much as this, in any other treatment of the darkening of Valinor, was what was going on outside of Tune, right? Outside of the city of the gnomes. What did the darkening, so what were the Teleri doing, right? I don't even know, and if I missed something, tell me. But he didn't. He talked about, he talks about the elves of Ing there in line 40. These are the group of elves which will later in the published Silmarillion be called the Vanyar. In the Book of Lost Tales, they were called the Teleri, and I can't tell from this poem whether or not he's changed that yet or not. He's still calling the Noldor the gnomes or the Noldoli, which are the terms that he did use in the Book of Lost Tales. So therefore, unless proven otherwise, I'm gonna keep using the Book of Lost Tales terminology, though it's really confusing because the Teleri, who were the the name Teleri switched between the one group of elves and the other. So, what were the Vanyar, but originally the Teleri. Anyway, so here's the description of what they were doing. What were they up to when Valinor was darkened? Of the three kindreds to that clamorous throng are none but the gnomes in numbers drawn. That it's to the throng there to hear Feanor's speech. The elves of Ing, to the ancient halls and starry gardens that stand and gleam upon Timbrinting, towering mountain, that day had climbed to the cloudy domed mansions of Manwë for mirth and song. There Brethil the Blessed, and the blue-mantled, the Lady of the Heights, as lovely as the snow, in lights gleaming as of the legion of the stars, the cold immortal Queen of Mountains, too fair and terrible, too far and high for mortal eyes, in Manwë's court sat silently as they sang to her. So that's what the Vanyar were up to when the darkening of Valinor happened. They were singing to Varda, to Elbereth, Brethil the Blessed. Notice how Brethil the Blessed there. Notice what would seem to be an anticipation of Elbereth there, but I'm not going to get too far into that. I'm way too ignorant about his languages to say anything definite there. Yeah, Nancy, I agree. Nancy says Varda doesn't come off too well here. She seems terribly distant and cold. Yeah, lovely as the snow, right? Yeah. I would also add, it's it also doesn't put her in the best light. So, Ungoliant and Melkor destroy the trees. So, Valinor's been darkened and everyone's like, dude, where were you when Morgoth broke in and destroyed the trees? And seriously, Varda's got to be all, I was being worshipped. I was sitting there, they were singing hymns to me, I got caught up in the moment, didn't notice Melkor coming in, sorry. There's it's not flattering, right? It doesn't seem flattering. I mean, I don't think it's meant to be a condemnation of her. It doesn't strike me as, I don't think this is like a jab at Varda. But it's mirth and song that's going on, right? And why shouldn't they be singing to Varda? And what would they be singing? You God, Karita anticipated me. What would they be singing? We can guess what they'd be singing, right? Snow white, O lady clear, O queen beyond the western seas. The poem that Gildor sings in the Shire. Gildor and Gildor's elves sing in the Shire. That's a song to Elbereth. Right, and notice we can see some of the same imagery here that we will still get in the Fellowship of the Ring. Right, as lovely as the snow, the cold immortal Queen of Mountains. Yeah. Yes, okay, Yana, you're right. It was kind of ironic to talk about Varda not being put in the best light. True, very true. Yeah, Joe asks, is this the beginning of the gods' disregard of their task in Middle-earth? Well, no, arguably that began when they invited the elves across. But, Matthew asks, am I sure they're not singing Tra-la-la-lally? Of course I'm sure they're not singing Tra-la-la-lally, because that's what you sing when you're down in the valley. They're up on a mountain, so it would be something different. I don't know what it would be. Tra-la-la-lountain, I here up on the mountain, something like that. Certainly, whether or not this is meant to be a criticism of Varda herself, it not only gives us a glimpse of the Vanyar, but it gives us a glimpse of the Valar. One of the things of which Feanor is going to accuse them is being remote and uncaring. And then we look at this and we're like, well, It's a fair cop, right? They got Varda banged to rights on that one. So several people are suggesting alternative lyrics. Tra-la-la leak, here up on the peak. Nancy Fosberg suggests Tra-la-la lily, high up on the hilly. Almost exactly. Karina and Matthew Hirschenroder suggested that same thing at the same time. Yeah, very good, very good. Sarah King says they do care. They just care for things that are remote, like the legions of the stars, right, Sarah? But anyway, it's interesting that we get this glimpse, because it does seem to suggest there is potentially some truth in Feanor's accusations. Feanor is not just crazed. Feanor is not just megalomaniacal. He is not just manipulative. He is all those things, but he's not just those things. There is some kind of substance there. Yeah, good. Then, of course, we get the parallel passage. What the Solo Simpi were doing. The Solo Simpi, that's the Book of Lost Tales term of the elves, which will, in the published Silmarillion, be called the Teleri, the sea elves, down by the coast. The foam riders, folk of waters, elves of the endless echoing beaches, of the bays and grottos and the blue lagoons, of silver sands sown with moonlit, starlit, sunlit stones of crystal, pale burning gems, pearls and opals on their shining shingle, where now shadows groping clutched their laughter. Quenched in morning, their mirth and wonder, in a maze wandered, under cliffs grown cold, calling dimly, or in shrouded ships shuddering waited, for the light no more should be lit forever. Wow. First of all, notice that this is one sentence, right? The foam riders is the subject of the sentence. What's the verb? What's the verb? This is always a fun game to play. Identify the verb of the sentence. Wandered. Got it. Yes, wandered. Weighted, yeah, you get credit for weighted too, because it's parallel, right? The foam riders, who are the foam riders? Folk of waters, elves of the endless echoing beaches. What beaches? Of the bays and grottos, the blue lagoons, of silver sands, all that stuff is the description of who they're the folk of, right? So the foam riders, those people. Oh, those people of the beaches. What are the beaches like? Oh, the beaches are like this. Oh, wait, but what are the beaches like now? Now the beaches are like this. But we're still all just describing the foam riders and who they are, right? In a maze, wandered. In a maze, adverbial phrase, wandered under cliffs, calling dimly, or in shrouded ships, shuddering, waited. So yes, the foam riders wandered or waited. Those are the verbs. But the imagery, the light and darkness imagery here, wow. The verb, this is the verb within the clause now, not the main verb of the sentence. That clutched. That clutched is my favorite word in this whole passage. Again, notice how this rolls. It's like those first four lines again. The foam riders, folk of waters, elves of the endless echoing beaches. Oh, let me tell you more about the beaches. Of the bays and the grottos and the blue lagoons, of silver sands sown with crystal gems, pearls, and opals. But wait, let me emphasize more the light, the shining, what a resplendent land this was. Moonlit, starlit, sunlit stones of crystal, right? Every time of the day or night there is light here, shimmering and shining and glistening on the jewels and gems. Just amazing. And so on those beaches, those beaches with all the pale burning stuff, and the shining shingle, that beach, where now shadows groping clutched their laughter, quenched in morning their mirth and wonder. So the beaches where now, and the action of the verb the action of the sentence, the action of the story, the coming in of the darkness, the effect of the darkening of Valinor upon them comes in not in the main verb of the sentence, but in the subordinate clauses, right? In the second half of the descriptions of the beaches. So these clauses describing the beaches are where the action happens, right? The shift from the beautiful shining light to the shadows all of a sudden groping out, clutching their laughter. That image is an incredible image. The groping shadow clutched their laughter, quenched in mourning their mirth and wonder. So we had they were laughing, they were mirthful, they were wondering, and now the shadows suddenly come in and clutch and quench that. And their wonder is turned to wandering and to shuddering waiting for the light that no more should be lit forever. Just incredible. So good. Good. Yeah, several of you, Josiah and Sarah, are saying, hang on a second, why are they moonlit and sunlit when the moon and sun haven't happened yet? Excellent questions. I don't know. No idea. Does this suggest that he was changing the sequence of things? Hard to imagine. I mean, how do we get to the sun and moon before the trees are destroyed? I don't know. Is he using those metaphorically? Like there is no adjective like moonlit. You wouldn't be like Telperian lit, right? That's not a good adjective. So we go moonlit instead because it is the light of the moon. Indirectly. Nancy says, I wondered that too, but it seemed churlish to sort of quibble at such a gorgeous phrase. Yeah, no, but I mean, but it's a fair question. It is a fair question, and it seems to me that the desire to represent the visual imagery, that is to depict in this moment, because all three forms of light are present, right? Though the sun and moon aren't up in the sky yet, but the yellow light of the sun, the silver light of the moon, and the fainter and very, very different textured light of the stars are all present, right? They are all there, and they are all glimmering on the stones of crystal, pale burning gems, pearls, and opals on the shining shingle. And so in three short words, he manages to convey that without having to use the sort of greater indirection that's going to be required. Good. Kate, of course. Christopher does talk about this. The theory Kate suggests that Josiah suggests seems to me perfectly plausible, that this poem was supposed to have been written by a poet later on, and who is using these images because that's what he's familiar with, and so that's how he talks about it. By the way, this seems to me another good reason why we've shifted to alliterative verse from that, hexameter, kind of awkward hexameter couplet thing that he was doing in The Fall of Gondolin. Because who are the later poets who are retelling these stories? Through whom are these poems being transmitted? Through the Anglo-Saxons, of course. That is through Alfwine of England in the later version of the Book of Lost Tales. So, the early Anglo-Saxons are, in Tolkien's conception at this point, the ones who are the transmitters of these stories of fairies. So of course they're going to be told in alliterative verse. What else would they be told in, right? So certainly thinking from that perspective, it kind of makes a lot of sense. Anyway. So I find this depiction of the chagrin of the foam riders of the Solosympi, chagrin. Boy, what an understatement that is. Just so powerful. And then of course, it's impossible not to be thinking about the kinslaying, right? What do they do when they're wandering and waiting, shuddering, waiting? What do? They wait in shrouded ships for the light. They take refuge in their ships. Right? Well, the light's gone. Their shining shingle isn't shining anymore, right? All of the beauty and the light of the world seems to have faded, or just been extinguished, and they're terrified and they don't know what's happening. They're far enough removed geographically from this to not be able to see what just happened, or not, as if that would be comforting. But anyway, just all of a sudden these groping shadows have clutched their laughter. So what do? They hide in their ships, right? They take refuge in their ships, because at least they have that still, right? All of the light and glory and beauty of their city and their land might have suddenly been snuffed out, but at least they still have their ships, right? That's something anyway. Awful, isn't it? Awful, isn't it? And then thinking the burning of the ships. Oh, awful, awful. Anyway, okay, one last passage here, then we'll move on to Earendel briefly. Here's some of Feanor's speech. Thus the witless wisdom its reward hath earned of the gods' jealousy, who guard us here to serve them, sing to them in our sweet cages, to contrive them gems and jewelled trinkets, their leisure to please with our loveliness, while they waste and squander work of ages, nor can Morgoth master in their mansions sitting at countless councils. I believe that means nor can they master Morgoth. It's not Morgoth mastering them, but they are also incapable of mastering Morgoth, is I think clearly what he's saying there. Now come ye all who have courage and hope. My call hearken to flight, to freedom in far places. The woods of the world, whose wide mansions yet in darkness dream, drowned in slumber, the pathless plains and perilous shores, no moon yet shines on, nor mounting dawn in dew and daylight hath drenched for ever. Yet far better were these for bold footsteps than gardens of the gods, gloom encircled, with idleness filled and empty days. Yea, though the light lit them, and the loveliness beyond heart's desire, that hath held us slaves here long and long, but that light is dead. Wow. This is really good. I think thinking about the way that Tolkien's revisions tended to happen, even just thinking about the kind of the pattern of revision that we saw between the first and the second version of the Lay of the Children of Húrin, I would guess that if Tolkien had come back to this and done a major revision of this, had he really expanded this, I bet we would have gotten more of this. His speech, Feanor's speeches seem short to me. I would have expected him to go on a good deal longer, but how does he depict things? Forget what the published Silmarillion says here. It contains an echo of some of these things, but the emphases are not the same, and the priorities that he gives to things are not the same here. How does he characterize the life of the gnomes? What reason does he give for leaving in this passage? Yeah, Kate wishes Christopher had interpolated this into the Silmarillion. It would have been really cool. Sarah King says she can't help but think of Milton's Satan here. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. Sarah, I can see where you're coming from there. I'm thinking in particular, far better were these for bold footsteps than the gardens of the gods gloom encircled, right? But it's not exactly right. He's not saying better to live to reign in hell than to serve in heaven, because of course the gardens of the gods. Notice how pathetic it's not just heaven, right? Yeah, they're the gardens of the gods. They're great, but they're gloom encircled, right? With idleness filled and empty days. They were never that great, actually, right? They're filled with idleness and empty days. The time in Valinor is pointless, right? We've been brought here, we've been put on the shelf here, right? Or rather, we've been put to work for the Valar. We make them trinkets, that's what we do, right? Notice how the opening lines here anticipate the enthrallment of the Noldor by Melkor, right? What does he do when he doesn't waste any of the Noldor when he captures them in the wars of the First Age in Beleriand, right? He doesn't waste a single Noldor. He puts them to work because they're really good, right? He makes them mine for him and shape things for him, just as Feanor here is accusing the Valar of doing, right? Amazing. So that's both sort of a foreshadowing and anticipation, but also sort of an indictment, right? Even when we see like, oh, there's dramatic irony here, right? The way that he's describing the Valar treating the Noldor is like this, this ironic anticipation of what Melkor will actually do, right? Yeah, but I think even if you were to be able to point that out to Feanor, he would say, yeah, exactly. That's kind of my point, right? How are they better than Morgoth? Of course Morgoth would do that. It's just what they did, right? As Tom says, not only were we slaves, we were bored slaves. Absolutely. There's another point I wanted to make. I lost my train of thought, though. Notice how the primary indictment against the Valar here is essentially idleness. Nothing happens here. Nothing is going on. Idleness and empty days, right? That's what the gardens of the gods are like. Yea, though the light lit them, and the loveliness beyond heart's desire that held us slaves here long and long. Yes, they were beautiful. But the beauty of Valinor is a trap. It was always a trap. We were enticed by it. We were drawn here, attracted by this loveliness, by the loveliness beyond heart's desire, but it enslaved us when we should have been in Middle-earth, making our own lives, making our own realms, doing something. Instead, we've just been hanging out here. Oh, kind of like the Vanyar up on the mountain, right? Worshipping Varda. So notice how he's twisted things around by line 102? But that light is dead. Oh, so why bother staying? Right? Valinor is dark now. Let's blow this joint. This place is lame now. Right? No, that's not what he's saying. Right? The light of Valinor has been destroyed. The beauty of the realm has been destroyed. Morgoth has wrecked this place, and they were helpless to stop it. Why should we stay? Right? They can't master Morgoth, right? So the darkening of Valinor proves the impotence of the Valar. So why should we obey them? Right? Is that what he's saying when he says, but that light is dead? Kind of. But there's more, right? Notice the implication? Exactly, Arthur. The light enslaved them, but that light is dead. The darkening of Valinor is not the tragedy which leads them to go into exile, right? Or which makes them decide to leave because nothing is left for them here. It has set them free, right? The darkening of Valinor, Feanor argues, and again, think of that description of the groping shadows clutching the laughter of the Solo-Simpi. Feanor says, the death of the light is a good thing. It has set us free. Now we shall no longer be held enslaved by the loveliness beyond heart desire, by the light that lit them. Arthur says Feanor is a free elf. Yeah, exactly. It's like he just caught a sock. Absolutely. Kind of amazing. I mean, there's something the like desire for establishing wide realms of their own, the impotence of the Valar, their pointless sitting around and not doing anything. All of those things are survive. We get those things in the published Silmarillion, but man, that final turn, we were enslaved by the beauty of Valinor, and now it is gone, and we are free. Fëanor didn't say that in the published Silmarillion. That's amazing. That's really kind of incredible. Yeah, the gnomes are for the gnomes, says Brandon. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Well, let's turn and look briefly. I keep hoping that it would be brief. That's okay. Let's turn and look for as long as we want at the Eärendil poem. The Eärendil poem, which, by the way, is, as Christopher explains, sort of hardest to guess what this poem is going to be. It's not labeled, right? It's not given a title, but so it's only Christopher's conjecture that this was going to be a poem of Eärendil. But that seems, I agree with him. His reasoning seems to be excellent, but it's funny, the big story of Eärendil, the big, most important story, which he never, ever tells, in which, ironically, like Bilbo's poem in Rivendell, is just about the fullest version of the Eärendil story that we ever get in Tolkien's works over the course of his entire life. Anyway, sorry. Okay, I'm not bitter about that or anything. Let's look at the opening of this third poem. Lo, the flame of fire and fierce hatred engulfed Gondolin, and its glory fell. Its tapering towers and its tall rooftops were laid all low, and its leaping fountains made no music more on the mount of Gwareth, and its white-hewn walls were whispering ash. But Wade of the Helsings, weary-hearted, Tur the Earthborn, was tried in battle, from the rack and ruin a remnant led. Women and children, and wailing maidens, and wounded men of the withered folk, down the path unproven that pierced the hillside, neath Tumladen he led them, to the leaguer of hills that rose up rugged as ranged pinnacles to the north of the vale. Okay. Kind of cool, huh? To get the opening lines of the Fall of Gondolin poem, right? Let's start with Maeglin, or Meglin. I'm not sure what he was going to be called, and then we get the opening of the Eärendil poem, which ends with the Fall of Gondolin, or begins with the end of the Fall of Gondolin poem. So we get the whole thing except all of the middle, or really almost all of the story. Yeah, Kate, I agree. Kate Neville says, is it ironic that the simple name Eärendil set Tolkien off on this whole mythological journey, but he could never find his way to telling that story to his satisfaction? Yeah, yeah. She says, Tolkien was trapped like Eärendil until Elwing came with the Silmaril. Yeah, maybe, except, I don't know, I guess it never arrived, because he never does tell it, really. But anyway, yeah. Okay. The big feature of this poem, as Christopher points out, remember Christopher in his commentary after this poem says there's really only one item of interest in this whole poem, and I knew just what it was when reading it through. Wade of the Helsings, weary-hearted. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail on Wade of the Helsings because Christopher Tolkien does a great job. He explains that at length, and it's a fascinating explanation. If you are in the... I don't know if any of you are developing like the anti-habit that so often plagues people reading The Lord of the Rings, right? I've often criticized people for reading the prose and skipping the poems, right, as they go through The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. I don't know if many of you are reading through the poems and skipping the prose in the Lays of Beleriand as we're going through. If we are, I encourage you not to. Christopher's commentary is very interesting, and as I say, I'm not... in my discussions here of these works, I'm sort of deliberately steering clear of the stuff that Christopher Tolkien talks about, because I don't need to say that stuff again. He's already said all that, right? And he's done, and so his discussions are excellent. I don't want anyone to think that I'm sort of writing them off or sort of shoving them aside. Rather, I'm kind of taking them as a given as we move forward. So I'm not going to explain the whole history of Wade of the Helsings, other than just to kind of comment on. To sort of comment on the significance of the fact that that's been put in here, right? As Christopher explains, the Wade, Wad, is a legendary hero. He's obviously huge. I mean, the stories of Wade, the references that we have to Wade show that he is a standard, a folklore hero. Everybody knows Wade. Everybody knows the stories of Wade. People are clearly, like in the Middle Ages, people are growing up with stories of Wade, this is they're like taking those in with their mother's milk. But we know very few stories about him. None of them are written down. We don't have I don't remember. If I'm forgetting, remind me of one, but I don't remember a single written version of any full story of Wade. He's this figure that gets alluded to, and always alluded to in the sense of what, it's like Wade. You guys know Wade, right? And yet it's so well known that nobody bothers to summarize it. Nobody bothers to tell it. They just take it as a given. And therefore, it's an incredibly tantalizing story. And again, if you know anything about Tolkien at all, you can see how attracted he would be to this idea, right? To say, okay, this figure of Wade, who was he? What is his story? What is the oral tradition that underlies these references in written poems throughout the Middle Ages? Who was he really? And the idea that concept, that he would at least even just flirt with the idea of incorporating that into his mythology. And of course we see what's the answer? Who is Wade? Tuor, right? Or Tuor as he's called here. Tuor is Wade, the father of Eärendil. And of course, he goes on to mention Christopher mentions that one incredibly tantalizing and significant for Tolkien fans reference to Wade, where it's where he has his ship Gwyngalot, which seems, what was Christopher's very understated phrase, his very significantly named ship Gwyngalot. It seems fairly clear, even just from that name, the fact that Wade apparently, whoever else he was or whatever else he did, he apparently had a ship named Gwyngalot. This seems to be, I don't want to say at the root of, but at least associated with the story of Tuor and Eärendil from the beginning. It's what's fascinating to me on reading this, the fact that he just threw out the Wade reference in this poem. Honestly, my response to that is not, wow, where's that coming from? It's obvious. I mean, like, that's like so right up Tolkien's alley. The question becomes, wow, why didn't he do that in the Book of Lost Tales? Right? How did Wade not come up in the Book of Lost Tales? Right? Wouldn't you think? I mean, especially the idea, Gwyngalot is there from the beginning. Gwyngalot is the name of the ship in the Book of Lost Tales. So, the connection to, I mean, that was probably, almost certainly, based on the name of Wade's ship. So, and it seems to be there. It seems to have been there in his mind, and yet that connection isn't made. Unless I'm forgetting it, but I don't think I am. He doesn't go anywhere near that in the Book of Lost Tales. Why not? That would have been so cool. It would have been great to see more on how was he going to develop the story of Wade, and how was that going to be linked in to the story of Eärendil, as he was going to go on and tell it, if he had ever gotten to go on and tell it in this poem. And again, so thinking about the fact that this is in alliterative verse, right, and the way that makes sense in the context of where he ended the Book of Lost Tales with Alfwine of England, and the idea of all of these stories of the ancient Elvish realms being transmitted through the Anglo-Saxons and through Anglo-Saxon oral tradition, of course we would expect that Wade would be involved there. Right, that this mysterious figure of Wade would probably be one of those characters, right, whose context had been forgotten, and unfortunately his story never written down. Gosh, in fact, doesn't that seem like a joke? Right, Wade, the character who is super, super important, but whose story is never actually written down and fully told. What else does he have in common with Eärendil, right? Apart from his boat. That's actually a really fascinating parallel, though I can't imagine it's one that Tolkien intended, as he seems to have tried to come back to tell the story of Eärendil again and again. But from the vantage point of the end of his life, looking back on his whole career, it certainly seems a very pointed irony, that connection between Wade and Eärendil. But yeah, Sir not appearing in this tale, Tom. Exactly. Sir not appearing in this mythology. Yeah. But this is a classic example, not the greatest example to talk about because there's so little detail here. But this is the kind of thing that Tolkien loved to do. This is one of those things which is, one of the places where we can see the, not even crossover. Crossover is such an inadequate word. The oneness, even, I want to say, the continuity between Tolkien's professional life and his creative life, the way in which his subcreation is the most perfect expression of his scholarly analysis of ancient literatures and ancient languages, and his thinking and imagining of those things really works together. Or, as I said, it's not even working together. It's like they are the same. It's how he thinks. It's how he works. Whether he's thinking about Goths and the ancient Gothic, or whether he's thinking about or whether he's thinking about Sigurd and Gudrun, or whether he's thinking about Beowulf and the Selic spell, or whether he's thinking about Wade and Tuor. All of these things seem to me just sort of part of that same fundamentally creative impulse, the way in which Tolkien sort of thought through these things by investing in them imaginatively through subcreation. Tolkien was, as I've been saying for a while now, Tolkien was not really fundamentally a teacher. He was a poet. He thought poetically, not analytically. Some have said there's been mixed reviews of Tolkien's lectures at Oxford. You find some of his former students who obviously found his lectures to be a life-changing experience. W.H. Auden, of course, comes to mind, who was deeply, profoundly affected by Tolkien's lectures in Anglo-Saxon, and was a sort of a friend and correspondent of Tolkien's throughout his life. You read some accounts of Tolkien's students where it sounds like they actually kind of hated him as a lecturer, and that his classes were really difficult to follow and even difficult to hear. That is, his actual speech was hard to follow because he spoke really quickly and indistinctly. So again, very mixed reviews of his teaching. But that's what I would expect. His gift was never in clear and lucid expository prose. One reading of On Fairy Stories will show you that. Unlike C.S. Lewis, for instance, who was an excellent writer of expository prose and a fantastic explainer of things in clear and approachable, logical language, Lewis excelled at that. That's how he thought. That's how he worked. Tolkien did not. That is not how he thought. How he thought was as a poet. And we can see... so I just love this little glimpse. And though, again, let me finish my thought. So it doesn't surprise me that the fact that he connected with things this way would leave his remarks on, his lectures on Anglo-Saxon a puzzle to some who found them impossible to follow and mind-blowing to some, right? That's kind of exactly what I would have expected, really. But anyhow, here again, we can just see a very distant glimpse of that same kind of sub-creative, imaginative process at work again. And that this one-line tantalizing hint of, I'm going to develop the story of Tuor and Earendel in an alliterative epic poem, which is also going to turn out to be the story of Wade that was never written down and nobody ever told before, right? That is so cool, and I would have loved to read this poem too. As you can see, Tolkien never started a fragment that I don't really want to see the end of. That's pretty true. Look at the end of the fragment here. All this have others in ancient stories and songs unfolded, but say I further how their lot was lightened. That's all this is at the end of the description of the sufferings of the survivors of Gondolin, right? How they escape, and we got a brief description of the fall of Glorfindel and fight with the Balrog, and then how they wandered for 30 months, right, and suffered and everything. So that's all this that he's referring to. All this have others in ancient stories and songs unfolded, but say I further how their lot was lightened, how they laid them down in long grasses in the land of willows. Their sun was softer, something the sweet breezes and whispering words, their wells of slumber and the dew enchanted. Those first two lines are to me the really fascinating thing. The I that we hear here, right? The poetic, the narrative framework that we get a brief glimpse of, right? How the speaker of this poem, the narrator of this poem, is explicitly contextualizing this poem in the context of other stories of ancient times, right? You've heard other songs, right? Like, I don't know, maybe one about the flight of the Noldoli, maybe one about the fall of Gondolin, maybe, because you might have heard that one, maybe the Lay of the Children of Hurin. But I say further, right? So I've just recalled to your memory this other song, this other poem that you may or may not have heard. Now I'm going to start telling you what I am telling, but again, in the context of these ancient stories and songs unfolded. And all this have others in ancient stories and songs unfolded. I'm going to unfold something else to you now, right? But again, notice it's not the reference to ancientry. The reference to ancientry here is not just a reference to how distant these events were compared to the narrator, right? This is not just like an Anglo-Saxon bard saying that the fall of Gondolin was in ancient days, right? What's ancient? What is he referring to as ancient there in the first line of that fragment? Another syntax quiz. What's ancient? Yeah, James, the stories themselves are ancient. Exactly. This is a modern poet, right? context of the Anglo-Saxon period, right? A modern poet who's not only speaking of ancient days, not only singing a song of ancient days, but singing a song which is connected to ancient songs of even more ancient days, right? So the stories of the fall of Gondolin are ancient. Not just the events, but the song itself, the story itself is an ancient story. Ancient stories and songs have unfolded these things about the fall of Gondolin, but I say further, right? I'm going to go on and tell you. I, the modern, am going to tell you what happened elsewhere. I'm going to tell you my modern version of this ancient story. The self-consciousness that this tiny little glimpse of a frame, right, of a narrative frame, but that glimpse puts this poem self-consciously into this ancient tradition of looking back and retelling. I guess I think back to Wade in the beginning of that earlier poem, right? The way in which we're going to go back and sort of flesh out ancient stories. That's what the speaker of this poem is self-consciously doing, right? I'm going to go back to those ancient stories that you've heard about the fall of, and I'm going to tell you more, right? I'm going to give you more about that. Really interesting. And yes, I agree, Karita, terribly ironic that I say further is practically the last thing that he says in this poem, right? I say further, never mind. I'm good, actually. It is kind of ironic, but and kind of sad. Yeah, it's true. Okay, good. Well, we got through all three of the fragments, everything except Light as Leaf on Linden Tree again, but that's okay. The reason I had been planning to do that last today anyway is that I want to look at Light as Leaf on Linden Tree as a transition into the Lay of Leithian anyhow. So we'll start with that next time. So go back. It's now that it will have been like 3 weeks. Go back and reread that poem, that stanzaic, rhyming, syllabic poem in the middle of the second version of the Lay of the Children of Hurin, the Baron and Luthien, the poetic treatment of the Baron and Luthien story. Go back and reread that. It's the original version that gets revised into Aragorn's song of Baron and Luthien that he sings under Weathertop. Go back and reread that, not Aragorn's version, the Children of Hurin version. Go back and reread that. We'll start with that, and we will then move forward from there into the Lay of Leithian, which seems, as we were saying last time, clearly what Tolkien himself is doing. So we will watch as Tolkien obeys, finally succumbs to the creative pressure to tell the Baron and Luthien story, and we'll start the Lay of Leithian after we do Light as Leaf on Linden Tree next time. So, thanks very much, everybody. I will see you guys in a week where I will be home. I think it looks like my internet connection, go mobile hotspot here tonight. Looks like we worked out okay. I'm very glad of that. Next week, I'll be back in my normal surroundings with my normal lighting and my normal high-speed internet connection, which will make me very happy. Thanks, everybody. Look forward to talking to you guys next week, and I will see you then. Bye now.